The lights in the UN Assembly Hall dimmed ever so slightly as Barack Obama stood behind the podium. Cameras clicked like distant rain. Ibrahim Traoré sat still, shoulders straight, expression calm, but eyes locked onto the man who once stood as the world's most powerful symbol of diplomacy. The room held its breath, and so did the continent, watching through flickering screens across Africa. Obama spoke, not as a former president, but as a witness. His words were measured, deliberate. But then came a line that shattered the rhythm, slicing through decades of noise and neglect. When a man chooses dignity over dollars, the world ought to listen. No applause, just silence. The hall was frozen, the air too heavy to move. Traoré didn't blink. He didn't nod. He simply sat there, hands resting on his lap, eyes glistening. Not with tears, with recognition. The kind that leaves a man speechless. Long before the cameras, long before the marble halls of diplomacy, Ibrahim Traoré was a boy standing barefoot in red dust. He didn't grow up with privilege or promises. He grew up with questions about justice, about power, about why some people had to kneel just to be seen. The answers didn't come easy, so he joined the military, not to follow orders, but to understand the system from within. What began as service became purpose. He rose through the ranks with quiet discipline, earning the respect of his peers not through fear, but through fairness. When corruption choked the country and leaders turned their backs on the people, it was Traoré who stood up, not with speeches, but with action. The people didn't elect him in a formal vote. They followed him because he listened when others lectured. To many, he is just a soldier. But in villages across Burkina Faso, he's more than that. He's a promise of dignity reclaimed, of sovereignty reborn. He rejected the golden handshakes and the veiled bribes of foreign donors. He said no to policies wrapped in aid but tied with chains. Traoré believes Africa does not need saving. It needs space to build its own future. And for this belief, he is both celebrated and condemned. But he doesn't shout. He doesn't posture. He moves with the quiet weight of a man who's carried both a rifle and a country's hope. And now, for the first time, he sits in a room where his silence will speak louder than most men's words. This wasn't just another diplomatic gathering. The United Nations General Assembly that year carried a heavier air. The world stood at a crossroads, economic tremors, climate crisis, unrest rumbling in places too long ignored. And in the middle of it all, Africa was being spoken about, but rarely spoken to. For many nations seated in that grand chamber, Burkina Faso was a footnote, a small, landlocked country too proud for its own good, some whispered. Yet here sat Ibrahim Traoré, not begging, not apologizing, simply present. His invitation had been debated behind closed doors. Some questioned whether he deserved a platform. Others feared what he might say. But Traoré didn't come to provoke. He came to declare that a different kind of African leader existed now, one who would not trade integrity for applause, one who believed that sovereignty wasn't a slogan, it was survival. Barack Obama's presence added weight. Though no longer in office, his words still echoed across continents. Traoré knew the world would listen to Obama before it listened to him. That didn't frustrate him, it focused him. This assembly wasn't just about policy or promises, it was about perception, and Traoré had come to change it, not through confrontation, but with quiet conviction. The chamber was dressed in polish, flags from every nation, voices wrapped in formal tones, and faces practiced in diplomacy. But beneath the ceremony there was posturing. Delegates from powerful countries sat with the ease of ownership, their confidence not born from truth, but from tenure. The air buzzed with side conversations and the soft tapping of expensive pens. When Traoré entered, the glances began. Some subtle, others not. Eyes drifted to his robes, woven cotton, dyed by hand. Not a suit, not a tie, not the uniform of global politics. A few diplomats smiled politely, the kind of smile that says, "You don't belong here, but we'll humor you." Cameras turned but didn't linger. Seated beside him, Marie, a sharp-eyed advisor with a notebook and a steel will, watched the room closely. "They don't see it yet," she whispered, "but they will." Traoré said nothing. He didn't come for their comfort. He came as a mirror. Around him, representatives spoke of development, of aid packages, of restructuring debt. But the words rang hollow, slogans recycled in high-rise offices far from the red soil of Africa. And yet, amidst the marble and microphones, Traoré sat still, a man carrying a continent's memory and preparing to reshape its future. When Barack Obama took the stage, the room leaned forward, not out of protocol, but respect. He no longer held office, but his presence still carried a global echo. His words didn't come wrapped in policy papers or diplomatic jargon. They came like a man speaking from memory, from lessons learned in power and after it. He spoke of leadership in fragile times, of compromise and the cost of ambition. He talked about the burden of being a symbol, especially when that symbol is dark-skinned in a world built on lighter tones. The hall listened, politely at first, then with something deeper. Then Obama paused. Looked toward Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré, he said, voice clear but quiet, reminds us that dignity isn't granted by global institutions. It's carried by those who build, even when the world doubts them. A murmur moved through the crowd, and then he said it. When a man chooses dignity over dollars, the world ought to listen. The room didn't move. Not a sound. No applause. No rustling of chairs. Just stillness. Traoré blinked slowly. His jaw didn't clench, but something shifted behind his eyes. For a man who had spent months dismissed as a radical, painted as a threat, this was not just a compliment. It was a crack in the wall, a moment where someone with global authority did not question him, but affirmed him. And in that second, the posture of the room changed. The doubt thinned. The air softened. Obama nodded, then stepped back from the podium. He had not spoken long, but he had spoken true. And Traoré sat there, silent. Not out of pride nor surprise, but because the words he'd fought to be heard for years had just been spoken by another man, and the world had finally listened. For most, silence is hesitation. For Ibrahim Traoré, it was discipline, a learned stillness that spoke more than 1,000 words. When Obama's voice faded and the room remained frozen, all eyes drifted back to him. Cameras zoomed, journalists leaned forward, waiting for a nod, a smile, any gesture. But Traoré sat unmoved. He wasn't stunned. He wasn't confused. He was remembering. Because long before that day, long before the marble floors and the velvet seating, he had stood in homes with no roofs, beside farmers with blistered hands and mothers cooking with firewood. He'd promised them he wouldn't speak for applause. He would speak for them. And now a man with the world's attention had spoken their truth. What words could he add? In the stillness, Marie glanced at him. She saw it too. Not pride, not ego, but a calm recognition. Obama hadn't just complimented Traoré. He'd affirmed the struggle of an entire generation who had been told they must ask permission to stand. Traoré's silence wasn't the absence of a voice. It was a storm held steady beneath the surface. It was the sound of generations heard at last. And for a man who had carried his nation's scars across battlefields and boardrooms, that silence was sacred. Let the others speak now, he thought. He would wait until the world felt the weight of what had just been said. The headlines came fast. Traoré left speechless by Obama. Burkina Faso leader caught off guard. A humbling moment at the UN. Pundits circled the silence like vultures, hungry for meaning. They debated whether Traoré had been overwhelmed, cornered, or simply out of his depth. But they missed the point entirely. Because in Traoré's world, in Africa's cultural core, silence is not surrender. It's reverence. It's power withheld until it must be used. In the villages where he walked, elders pause before they speak, not because they're uncertain, but because they understand the weight of words. A pause is reflection, not retreat. It is the breath between history and future. The media, trained to read performance, couldn't decode dignity. They searched for a soundbite, but Traoré had given them something rarer, a stillness filled with meaning. Marie watched the news tickers from her hotel room window, the city lights of New York flickering like distant fireflies. She turned off the screen and whispered to no one, "Let them write what they want." Because the truth didn't live in headlines. It lived in that moment, when a young African president chose not to react, but to respect. And in doing so, he changed the room without saying a word. Away from the cameras, the marble and the murmurs, Two men stood quietly in a narrow corridor behind the stage. The world had returned to its noise. But here, there was stillness again. Barack Obama extended his hand, not as a politician, but as a peer. Traore took it without hesitation. "You're doing what many only dream of," Obama said, his voice low, sincere. Traore didn't smile. He simply nodded, then replied, "You gave us the words we weren't allowed to say. No cameras, no notes, no headlines. Just truth exchanged between two men from different worlds. One who had carried the weight of global expectation, and one who now carried the hopes of a continent still learning to walk with its own voice. They didn't linger. They didn't need to. They parted not as symbols, but as men who understood the cost of leadership. And in that hallway, history didn't shout. It nodded. The speech ended, the lights dimmed, and the room emptied. But the moment didn't stay behind. It traveled. Across West Africa, radio stations replayed the line again and again. When a man chooses dignity over dollars. In small towns without internet, elders repeated it beside cooking fires. In university dorms in Ghana, Kenya, and Senegal, students stayed up debating what it meant for the future. It wasn't just what Obama said, it was that Traore didn't need to say anything at all. On social media, African youth lit up timelines. Some posted memes, others tears, but all of them understood. Something had shifted. Traore had not bowed, not begged, and yet he had been heard. Even those who once dismissed him as a populist or a firebrand now paused to reconsider. Perhaps, one European analyst wrote, he's not defying the world, he's redefining his place in it. When Traore returned to Ouagadougou, there was no parade, no grand declaration, just the warm wind, the scent of dust and mango, and the quiet eyes of people who knew. Validation doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives in silence, shared across 1,000 miles, and felt in the hearts of millions. Dignity is not a speech. It's not a slogan printed on banners or a policy tucked into a binder. It is quieter than that, harder to see but impossible to ignore. It lives in the choices a man makes when no one is watching, in the way he holds his ground when it would be easier to fold. Ibrahim Traoré didn't win the room with volume. He won it with presence. In a world trained to measure power by how loudly you speak, he reminded us that silence, when rooted in strength, is louder than thunder. Obama's words were a recognition, Traoré's silence, a response. One acknowledged history, the other carried it forward. That day, no deals were signed, no resolutions passed, but something deeper was laid down, a shift in posture, in perception, in pride. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for every forgotten corner of the world that's been told to wait its turn. As the sun set over Ouagadougou and the dust returned to stillness, Traoré stood once more beneath that sky, unchanged in purpose, but no longer unheard. Because respect, real respect, is not demanded. It is lived, and when it is, the world has no choice but to listen.